She sneered at the couple as they took their seats, certain they didn't belong in first class. But she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. The luxury cabin of the international flight was nearly full. Plush seats, crystal-clear windows, and flight attendants in crisp uniforms created an air of exclusivity. Passengers settled in, adjusting their seats, sipping pre-flight drinks, and flipping through in-flight magazines. First class wasn't just a seat, it was an experience. That's why, when a well-dressed couple walked in, the air shifted ever so slightly. The flight attendant, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s named Brenda, raised an eyebrow as she saw them approach. The woman, elegant in a navy blue dress, carried herself with grace. The man, dressed in a tailored blazer, had an air of quiet confidence. But Brenda's gaze lingered a little too long. Something about them bothered her. Maybe it was how effortlessly they moved through the first-class aisle. Maybe it was how the man reached for his wife's hand, exchanging a quiet smile. Or maybe it was the fact that they were an interracial couple. Brenda's lips curled ever so slightly in disapproval. She stepped in front of them before they could sit. "I think you may be in the wrong section," she said, forcing a tight smile. The couple exchanged glances. The woman was the first to speak, her voice calm, poised. "Our seats are 3A and 3B. Brenda hesitated. There was no mistake. They belonged here. But she couldn't stop herself from adding, "Would you like me to double-check for you?" A murmur of quiet interest spread through the nearby passengers. Some averted their eyes, pretending not to notice. Others exchanged knowing glances. They had seen this kind of moment before. The husband reached into his pocket, smoothly pulling out 2 pristine first-class boarding passes. Without a word, he handed them over. Brenda's cheeks burned as she took them. She glanced at the tickets, forcing herself to find something wrong. But there was nothing. First class. Row 3. Paid in full. Brenda swallowed, her jaw tightening. She had already made a scene. She plastered on a fake smile and handed the tickets back. "Welcome aboard." The couple didn't react. They simply took their seats, their silence speaking louder than any argument. Brenda turned on her heel, muttering under her breath. They probably used reward points. But as she stalked down the aisle, she failed to notice something. At the front of the cabin, the captain had entered first class. And the moment he laid eyes on the couple, his face broke into a wide smile. Passengers looked up, sensing something was about to happen. Brenda, feeling smug about putting the couple in their place, had no idea she was seconds away from the biggest humiliation of her life. Brenda smoothed her uniform and took a deep breath. She had done her part. She had subtly reminded the couple that they didn't belong, or at least, they shouldn't have. She told herself she wasn't being unfair. Just careful. After all, first class wasn't cheap. People worked their whole lives to afford a seat here. She glanced back at the couple. They were too calm. The husband had pulled out a leather-bound book, flipping through the pages as if he didn't have a care in the world. His wife adjusted her seat, thanking a passing attendant with a warm smile. They were too comfortable. Brenda frowned. She wasn't done yet. She walked briskly to the front of the cabin, where another flight attendant, Lauren, was adjusting the service cart. "Hey," Brenda whispered, leaning in. "Did you see the couple in 3A and 3B? Lauren barely looked up. "What about them?" Brenda scoffed. "Don't they seem out of place?" Lauren finally turned, eyebrows furrowing. "What do you mean?" Brenda rolled her eyes. "Come on, Lauren. You know what I mean." She nodded toward the couple. "They probably used reward points or got an upgrade. I bet they don't even fly first class regularly." Lauren's expression hardened. "Brenda, they showed you their tickets, right?" Brenda crossed her arms. Yeah, but that doesn't mean. Then drop it. Lauren's voice was firm. She wasn't playing along. Brenda's jaw tightened. Fine. If no one else cared, she would handle this herself. She made her way back down the aisle, stopping just in front of 3A and 3B. The wife looked up, her expression neutral. Is there a problem? Brenda's fake smile returned. I just wanted to make sure everything is to your liking, she said sweetly. You know, since first-class service might be new for you. The wife's lips parted slightly, not in surprise, but in realization. She knew exactly what was happening. Her husband, however, didn't look up from his book. Instead, he turned a page and said calmly. We're quite comfortable, thank you. Brenda's stomach twisted. She wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. Normally, when she asserted authority, people got flustered. They apologized. They shrunk under her presence. But this couple? They weren't reacting at all. Brenda glanced around, suddenly aware that other passengers were watching. Some whispered behind their hands. Others exchanged knowing looks. Her pulse quickened. She had pushed too far. Then, suddenly, a shadow loomed over her. A deep voice spoke from behind. Brenda. She spun around. And her stomach dropped. The captain stood there, arms crossed, a puzzled expression on his face. But what shook Brenda the most wasn't his presence. It was the way he was looking at the couple. Like he knew them. Like they were important. Brenda's throat went dry. Something was very, very wrong. And for the first time, she felt the creeping sensation of regret. Brenda's pulse pounded in her ears. The captain, her captain, stood before her, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. He wasn't just passing through. He was here for a reason. And worst of all, he was looking at them. The couple in 3A and 3B remained perfectly composed, yet something about their silence made Brenda uneasy. The wife lifted her chin slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. The husband, still holding his book, finally looked up. And then it happened. The captain's stern face melted into pure joy. Well, I'll be damned, he grinned, stepping forward. I didn't know you were on this flight. Brenda froze. The passengers around them stirred, their interest piqued. A few exchanged glances. A few whispered. The husband closed his book, smiling back. It's been a while. The captain clasped his hand, shaking it firmly. How long has it been? 10 years? Closer to 15, the husband replied. Brenda's stomach twisted. This wasn't some ordinary passenger. She felt exposed, standing there in her crisp uniform, as everyone watched the scene unfold. Wait, you two know each other, she blurted out, regretting it the second the words left her lips. The captain turned to her slowly. There was something in his gaze she didn't like. I should hope so, he said. He was my mentor. Brenda's breath caught. Passengers nearby reacted with murmurs of surprise. Even Lauren, the other flight attendant, turned her head sharply. Brenda blinked. I'm sorry, your mentor? The captain nodded, still smiling. This man right here is the reason I became a pilot. He patted the husband's shoulder. One of the finest aviation minds I've ever known. Brenda's face burned. The man she had just treated like an intruder, was someone important. She glanced at the wife, who was watching her carefully. Not with anger, not with smugness, just calm observation. Brenda tried to recover. Oh, of course. I was just making sure everything was perfect for our first-class guests, she said quickly. The captain's smile faded slightly. His sharp eyes flickered over her, as if he was putting the pieces together. Brenda felt the weight of the other passengers watching. She swallowed, stepping back, heart hammering in her chest. But then, another voice cut through the air. A passenger, a middle-aged businessman in 4C, leaned forward. "Wait a second," he murmured, narrowing his eyes at the couple. Brenda barely had time to react before he added, "Isn't that the man who—" He didn't even finish. Because in that moment, several passengers gasped. Brenda's breath hitched. The murmurs grew louder. And then it hit her. This wasn't just a respected pilot. This man, this passenger she had just mocked, was someone famous. Someone far more powerful than she had ever imagined. And she had just insulted him. Brenda's breath caught as the whispers in first class grew louder. The businessman in 4C was still staring at the couple, his brows furrowed as if trying to place a distant memory. "Wait," he murmured, pulling out his phone. His fingers moved quickly, typing something. Brenda's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The captain, her captain, was treating this man like a mentor. Now passengers were recognizing him. And Brenda? She had mocked him. She had insulted him. The wife turned slightly, looking Brenda in the eye for the first time. Brenda swallowed hard. There was no anger in the woman's expression. No smugness. Just a calm, knowing gaze. Brenda's pulse quickened. The businessman suddenly let out a low whistle. He turned his phone screen toward the nearest passenger. "It's him," he muttered. "Holy hell. It's really him." A woman in 5A gasped softly. "Oh my God." Brenda's skin prickled. What were they talking about? She couldn't take it anymore. "Who?" she demanded, her voice sharper than intended. "Who is he?" The businessman in 4C glanced at her, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You really don't know?" he asked, shaking his head. He leaned back in his seat, chuckling under his breath. "No wonder you're sweating." Brenda stiffened. More passengers were whispering now. Some were nodding in realization. Brenda turned to the husband, who simply watched her with that same unreadable look. Her hands felt clammy. This was bad. Very, very bad. The businessman tossed his phone down on the tray table. The screen was still lit, displaying an article. Brenda leaned in slightly, eyes scanning the headline. And then, her breath stopped. Headline: Aviation legend retires from public eye, the man who changed the airline industry forever. Subheading: James Carter, former Air Force pilot, airline CEO, and aviation pioneer, quietly steps away from the spotlight after decades of groundbreaking contributions. Brenda's stomach dropped. The man she had just insulted. The man she had assumed didn't belong in first class. Was James Carter. A former fighter pilot. A multimillionaire airline mogul. A man who had trained some of the world's best pilots, including their captain. Her legs felt weak. She stared at the screen, willing it to change. Wishing this was some horrible mistake. But it wasn't. Passengers were still murmuring, shaking their heads. Some were staring at Brenda, their expressions filled with judgment. They had seen how she treated him. They had heard her snide comments. And now? Now they knew the truth. Brenda's chest tightened. James Carter. The aviation legend. And she had just humiliated him in front of a plane full of people. James sighed softly, setting his book down. His eyes met Brenda's, calm and steady. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice even. Brenda's lips parted. No words came out. She was frozen. And for the first time in her career, she was terrified. Brenda couldn't breathe. Her body felt weightless, like she was free-falling. James Carter. She had just mocked James Carter. Not just a first-class passenger. Not just a wealthy businessman. But a legend. The man who had shaped modern aviation. The man who had trained top pilots. The man who had built entire airlines from the ground up. And she had insulted him. Passengers around her continued to whisper, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Brenda's face burned. She tried to think fast, to come up with some kind of recovery, but every excuse that popped into her head sounded hollow. She had treated him like an outsider. Like he didn't belong. Like he wasn't one of the most powerful men in the industry. The weight of the moment crushed her. The businessman in 4C smirked, leaning back in his seat. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "I knew the airline industry had changed, but I didn't think it had fallen this far." A quiet chuckle rippled through a few passengers. Brenda's throat tightened. She turned to the captain, silently pleading for help, but his expression was unreadable. James Carter was watching her. He didn't look angry. He didn't look pleased. He just looked disappointed. That was worse. Much, much worse. Brenda forced a smile, trying to regain control. "Mr. Carter," she said quickly, her voice a little too bright, I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable. We always strive for the best service in first class." The wife, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. Her voice was calm. Measured. "Oh," she said. "Is that what you were doing?" Brenda's stomach twisted. She turned to the wife, but there was no warmth in her gaze. Just a knowing look. Brenda swallowed. "Of course." The wife nodded slowly, her eyes still locked onto Brenda's. "And if we weren't James Carter and his wife," she asked, her voice still gentle, "how would we have been treated?" Brenda felt a sharp pang in her chest. The murmurs around her stopped. Everything in the cabin went silent. Passengers were watching. Listening. Waiting for an answer. Brenda's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Well. She had no answer. She knew the truth. Everyone on that plane knew the truth. If this had been any other couple, she wouldn't have given them a second thought. She would have continued to mock them in silence. Would have assumed the worst. But now? Now she was face to face with her own actions. With who she really was. And James Carter wasn't stopping her. He wasn't telling her off. He was simply waiting. Brenda's legs felt weak. She had messed up. Badly. The businessman in 4C let out a soft chuckle. "This is priceless," he muttered, shaking his head. Brenda's face burned. She wanted to turn, to walk away, but she was trapped. She had spent her entire career controlling first-class cabins, ensuring only the right people felt welcome. Now, for the first time, she was the one who didn't belong. And there was no escaping it. Brenda's heart pounded in her chest. The silence in first class was heavy, thick with tension. Every second stretched longer than the last. Passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. They were watching. All of them. Brenda's palms were damp. She had to fix this. Fast. She forced a polite smile, straightened her uniform, and turned back to James Carter. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice too bright, too forced, "I truly apologize if there was any misunderstanding. Our goal is always to make sure first-class passengers are treated with the utmost care and—" James Carter tilted his head slightly. He wasn't buying it. Brenda felt it, the way he was studying her, the way his sharp, experienced eyes seemed to see right through her. She swallowed. Passengers exchanged glances. Some shook their heads. Brenda's stomach twisted. She had to regain control. Had to steer the conversation. She turned to the wife. Maybe if she could get on her good side. But the wife simply raised an eyebrow. Cool. Composed. Brenda's throat tightened. This wasn't working. She needed help. Her eyes darted around the cabin until she found Lauren, the other flight attendant, by the service cart. Brenda rushed over. Lauren, she whispered, grabbing her arm. I need you to back me up here. Lauren looked at her, confused. Back you up? Brenda nodded quickly. Just, say something. Smooth this over. Please. Lauren's expression hardened. I'm not going to lie for you, Brenda. Brenda's breath hitched. Passengers nearby had heard that. More whispers. More stares. Brenda felt the walls of the plane closing in on her. She turned back to the couple, her body tensed. She could still fix this. She could. Excuse me, miss. A new voice. Brenda spun around. A middle-aged woman in 5A was watching her with disapproval. You didn't seem so eager to be helpful a few minutes ago, she said, her voice sharp. A few passengers murmured in agreement. Brenda's chest tightened. This wasn't just between her and James Carter anymore. Now the entire cabin was against her. She turned back to James, her lips trembling slightly. He was still sitting there, calm. Watching. Waiting. Her panic spiked. She had to escape. Had to get out of this situation before it got worse. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly toward the front of the plane. She needed to think. Needed a plan. She reached the small flight crew area behind first class and pressed her hands to the counter, breathing heavily. This couldn't be happening. Her mind raced. Would they file a complaint? Would the airline get involved? She wasn't sure. All she knew was she had just messed up. Badly. And for the first time, she realized she might not be able to fix it. Brenda gripped the edge of the counter, her breath coming fast and shallow. She needed to think. She needed to fix this. But how? She had spent her career keeping order in first class, making sure the right passengers were treated with the right level of respect. But now? Now she was the one on the outside. A voice crackled over her crew radio. Brenda, please return to first class immediately. Her stomach dropped. She turned, hesitating for just a moment before stepping back through the curtain. The first-class cabin was dead silent. Every passenger was watching her. And standing at the center of it all, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The captain. Brenda's pulse raced. Sit, he said. Brenda hesitated. Crew members never sat in first class. But the captain didn't repeat himself. He just waited. Brenda's knees felt weak as she lowered herself into an empty first-class seat. The couple still sat calmly in 3A and 3B. The wife looked at Brenda for a long moment before turning to her husband. She should hear it from you, she said softly. Brenda stiffened. James Carter sighed, leaning forward slightly. Brenda, he said, his voice even, steady, too calm, do you know what I used to do before I ran an airline? Brenda's lips parted, but no sound came out. James nodded. I trained pilots, he continued. Not just commercial pilots, Air Force pilots. A few passengers gasped. Brenda's heart pounded. James smiled slightly. And do you know what happens in a cockpit when a pilot makes a bad decision? Brenda swallowed hard. I don't. James tilted his head. A good captain doesn't yell. He doesn't throw a tantrum. He simply gives them a moment to realize what they did. Brenda's chest tightened. This was it. He wasn't just exposing her mistake, he was letting her sit in it. She had spent years making passengers feel small when they didn't belong. And now? Now she was the one shrinking. The captain cleared his throat. "Brenda," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "is this how you treat all your passengers?" Brenda's breath caught. All eyes were on her. Passengers waited. The crew waited. Even Lauren stood nearby, her arms crossed. Brenda's hands clenched into fists. She had one chance. One final chance to say the right thing. She opened her mouth. But the truth was, for the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. Brenda sat frozen in the first-class seat, her heart hammering. The captain's question hung in the air. "Is this how you treat all your passengers?" Her mind raced for an answer, any answer, but she knew there was nothing she could say. Passengers were watching. Listening. Waiting. The silence dragged on. James Carter was still seated calmly, his hands resting on the book he had barely opened. His wife sat beside him, her gaze steady and patient. Brenda swallowed hard. She had one chance. She sat up straighter, forcing a polite smile. "Mr. Carter," she began, voice shaky but controlled, I truly apologize if there was a misunderstanding earlier. I only wanted to ensure that all first-class guests received the best possible experience." The wife tilted her head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" Brenda stiffened. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads. Brenda rushed on. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," she added quickly. "It was just protocol, you see. We like to verify all passengers are seated correctly, and..." James Carter let out a soft sigh. He wasn't angry. He wasn't raising his voice. But the way he looked at her, like he had seen this exact behavior too many times before, made Brenda's stomach twist. His voice was calm, even. "Tell me something, Brenda." Brenda's breath caught. "If I had been a different man," James continued, "just a regular passenger, no name, no reputation." His eyes met hers. Cool. Sharp. Unforgiving. "Would you have treated me the same way?" Brenda's throat tightened. Passengers shifted in their seats. The air felt heavier. Brenda forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Oh, I assure you, Mr. Carter, we treat all first-class passengers with the utmost respect and care." The wife spoke again. "And if we weren't in first class?" she asked, her voice calm but pointed. Brenda's breath hitched. She opened her mouth. Closed it. She had no answer. Because they all knew the truth. Brenda had made an assumption. A choice. One that had exposed her in front of everyone. The businessman in 4C let out a low chuckle. "Yeah, that's what I thought," he muttered, shaking his head. More whispers. More murmurs of agreement. Brenda's chest tightened. This was spiraling out of control. She needed to leave. She needed to get away from this. A voice crackled over her crew radio, making her jump. "Brenda, please report to the front of the plane. Now." Brenda froze. Passengers around her exchanged knowing glances. Brenda stood quickly, smoothing her uniform, trying to act composed. She turned to James Carter and his wife, forcing one last, desperate smile. "Please enjoy the flight," she said quickly, before turning and walking away as fast as she could. She didn't look back. But she felt it. The weight of their gazes. The humiliation. The realization that this mistake wouldn't just disappear. As she reached the front of the plane, a single, final thought hit her. She had spent years controlling first class, deciding who belonged and who didn't. But now? For the first time in her career. She was the one who didn't belong. Brenda stood at the front of the plane, her hands shaking. She had escaped the first-class cabin, but the feeling of humiliation clung to her like a second skin. She turned the corner, stepping into the crew-only area, and took a slow, shuddering breath. She had never felt like this before. For years, she had believed she knew how the world worked. She knew who belonged in first class and who didn't. She knew how to carry herself with authority, how to command respect. But today, she had been completely wrong. And now, the entire cabin knew it. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to collect herself. A few moments later, a senior crew member, Helen, entered the small space. Her face was unreadable. "Brenda," she said. "The airline wants to speak with you after we land." Brenda's stomach dropped. "Why?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Helen's expression softened. "We received multiple complaints." Brenda's throat tightened. "From passengers?" Helen nodded. "From first class." Brenda's legs felt weak. Helen sighed. "You should prepare yourself. This doesn't look good." Brenda swallowed hard. She had seen this before. Other flight attendants being called in for talks with management. Some received warnings. Some were given sensitivity training. And some never wore the uniform again. Brenda felt sick. She had spent her career policing first class, ensuring only the right people were treated well. And now, for the first time, she understood what it felt like to be on the other side. To be watched. Judged. Questioned. To feel like she didn't belong. She turned back toward the first-class cabin, just in time to see James Carter and his wife still seated in 3A and 3B. They weren't looking at her. They weren't laughing at her mistake. They were simply existing, calm and dignified. Because that's what truly powerful people do. They don't have to prove anything. They just are. And Brenda had spent so much of her life misunderstanding that. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. As she stepped back toward the crew station, she heard the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. On behalf of our crew, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today." Brenda closed her eyes. She wasn't sure what would happen when the plane landed. Would she lose her job? Would she be given a second chance? She didn't know. But she knew one thing for certain. She would never make this mistake again. And for the first time in her life, she understood why. Final line. Respect isn't about who you think deserves it. It's about how you treat everyone, even when you don't know who they are.